ॐ स्थापकाय च धर्मस्य सर्वधर्मस्वरूपिणे अवतारवरिष्ठाय रामकृष्णाय ते नमः। ॐ परतत्वे सदा लीनो रामकृष्णसमाज्ञाय यो धर्मस्थापनरतो वीरशङ्खं नमाम्यहम्। I praise that avatara, that incarnation of the highest reality who establishes the dharma. That reality is verily from time to time embodied in form. Salutations to that avatara. Salutations to Jesus Christ. Salutations to that apostle of the avatara who is ever absorbed in the absolute reality. That apostle who is ever active in establishing the dharma by his master's command. I salute Sri Ramakrishna and Swami Vivekananda. I salute Jesus Christ and Paul and all the other apostles. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Hari Om Tat Sat. Shri Ramakrishna Arpanamastu. Dharma. Happy Good Friday, one and all. It's particularly important that these past few days we've been talking about Martanda Bhairava. So it's the Bhairava of the setting sun. So as you know, in the Vedic tradition, there are many different names for the sun. Surya is, of course, a very common name, but Vivasvan, Bhasvan, so many different names. Vivasvate, you know that mantra, Om Namo Vivasvate, Brahman Bhasvate, Vishnu Tejase, Tejase. All of this in the vocative form celebrates the sun in the various aspects of the sun's effulgence and beauty and power. And we had a long conversation yesterday evening about why the sun was such a powerful metaphor for the ancient Vedic civilization when it came to describing the absolute nature of reality. Its effulgence is obviously a direct reference to consciousness, the light of spirit which shines within. And so that's one reason. But also the whole entire universe depends on it. I mean, not necessarily the universe, but at least the solar system depends on our sun. And our earth in particular hangs in the balance of the sun's warmth and power and light. So we talked about the sun as the Divakaram, the maker of the day, but importantly as the Sarva Karma Dayine, the giver of all actions. Without the light of the sun and without the heat of the sun, it would be impossible to get nourishment. It would be impossible to go about our day and do our various activities. And more importantly, the sun, because of its power and energy, is not just a metaphor for consciousness, it's also a metaphor for the energy inherent in consciousness, which creates, maintains, and destroys the world. In the form of this body, it's called Kula Kundalini. So it's that same energy, that goddess which runs the entire universe and the cycles and patterns and the rhythms of the universe, that same energy abides in this body as Kula Kundalini, the Kundalini of the body, if you will. So that Kundalini is the power of consciousness, the Shakti of consciousness. And it can be understood in terms of prana. Blood flows by virtue of Kundalini. The breath flows, the lymphatic system operates, the nervous system operates. Every physical process operates because of this Kundalini, which powers up the body. And the psychical activity too, the thoughts, the emotions, the dreams, our ability to process and digest events, our ability to learn and memorize and recall things from memory, all this psychic or pranic digestion is also in the domain of Kula Kundalini. So she's responsible not only for our physicality, but also our our psychology, our psychicality. That's Kula Kundalini. So that energy can be understood as prana. Prana vibrating in one way is called the body, vibrating in another way is called the mind. Both mind and body are like waves rising in the ocean of prana. That prana is the best metaphor for it is probably the sun, because the sun is not only nourishing the entire universe, but the food that we eat, which is nourished by the sun, is like eating the sun almost. Second hand in the case of plants, or third hand when we consume animals or something. Like the animals consume the plants consume the sunlight, and so in a sense we're consuming sunlight through our eating. And some people, like some yogis, are able to get it direct, just like the plants. And then that sunlight becomes prana. And so it allows people to move about and do things. So it's truly sarva karma dayane, the giver of all action in the form of prana, which enlivens the body and which enlivens the mind. So we've been talking about the sun and how it represents Jaima, Martanda Bhairava, how it represents existence in the sense that every existing thing is made up of existence, the way every wave is made up of water, the way every gold ornament is made up of gold, the way every clay pot is made of clay. So clay pots, yeah. This is Karankini Mudra. Bhairava. Karankini Mudra. comes naturally to little Ganas like that. Anyway, so this idea that the whole of the universe is consisting of existing things, physical and psychical, and those existing things are to existence what waves are to water, what golden ornaments are to gold, what clay pots are to clay. They're dependent on that material cause, that reality. And so without the clay, there would be no pots. Without the water, there'd be no waves. And without the gold, there would be no ornaments. Just like that, without existence, there would be no reality. Without the sun, there would be no cycles, all of that. So we said the sun is a very important metaphor for existence. It's a very important metaphor for consciousness because of its effulgent nature. Just like consciousness shines, so too does the light of the sun shine and illumine everything. But it's also a really great metaphor for ananda, bliss, because the sun is beautiful. It has an aesthetic and poetic quality. Who hasn't been moved by the setting and rising sun? Who hasn't been awed by the midday sun? The sun is very, very important in terms of its aesthetic and poetic capacity to stir the soul. So Sat existence, Chit consciousness, and Ananda bliss is best captured by the sun. And already here you can see an important bhakti principle. Spiritual themes, spiritual ideas are interacted with through symbols. The symbol is indispensable. Brahman is beyond all symbols. And yet, without the symbol, we wouldn't be able to meditate on Brahman, to intuitively feel the reality that we call existence, consciousness, and bliss. So, the Surya is a very important symbol for Brahman. And so the Sandhya Vandana, the ritual that we do at dawn or twilight, a ritual that Brahmin boys learn when they're very young at age 9, that is a sun worship ritual, the veneration of the sun, which we literally see in the sky. But it's importantly a veneration of Brahman, which shines within as existence, consciousness, bliss. So sun in the tantric world is called Martanda Bhairava. Bhairava, of course, a name for the fierce form of Shiva. And maybe the name Bhairava came after the Saurya cult was absorbed into the Shaiva Shakta world. But at one point in time, in the classical tantric period, there was a tradition of worshipping the sun, which was a religion unto itself. They were called the Saurya Margins, the way of the sun, if you will, the worshippers of the way of the sun. And so their monotheistic ideal was Surya, the sun, who they called Martanda Bhairava. And Martanda Bhairava is Prakasha Shakti Sahitaya, along with his Shakti, which is the power and radiance and the heat. Vishnu Tejase. You don't get Vishnu without Tejas. Similarly, you don't get Shiva without Shakti. That Shakti, when it comes to the sun, is its heat. And so the metaphor of the sun and its rays is a very important example for the metaphor of God in the world, or Shiva and Shakti, if you will. So this solar image is there in the Vedic world. It's there in the Tantric world. The Saurya tradition has, like I said last night, all but died out. There's no independent standalone community called Sauryas anymore. And there aren't really that many Ganapatins either. There are some in India still. Their main rishi is Ganaka Rishi, like I was saying yesterday. But the Ganapati community and the Saurya community, which at a time were religions unto themselves, who saw both Ganesh and Surya as the monotheistic ideal of the universe, they've been somewhat assimilated into the broader Shaiva and Shakta tantric worlds, if you will. Anyway, the Sauryas, they worship the sun literally, just like we do now with the Sandhya Vandana. They worship the sun at dawn, they worship the sun at noon, they worship the sun at dusk, all these moments of sandhis, they're called transition moments. And they also worship the sun at midnight. These 4 periods were very important: when the sun was directly above, when it was cresting the horizon, and when it was dipping below the horizon, and when it was directly below, in a sense. So these 4 directions, if you will: dawn, noon, dusk, and midnight, the 4 moments of the sun. So this worship of the sun, literally the sun in the sky, was a very important metaphor for the worship of the sun within. And so the journey of the human being through life is in some ways likened to the journey of the sun through the sky. The day became a complete metaphor for the universe. And like I said, the sun sets the rhythm of time. So if you say Kali or Bhairava, Kala, Mahakala are the supreme reality of the cosmos, then the Saurya Margin will say, but you see, if Kali is time, if Bhairava is time, Mahakala, then what does time do? It devours everything, right? So it's very powerful. It's the ultimate reality in that it devours everything. Except it's the penultimate reality. Because from our point of view, the Saurya Margin might say, the sun controls time. It's the sun rising that causes the day to have a certain rhythm. Like my friend Jackie posted today on Instagram. She was like, wait, there was a meme she posted. It was like, you don't even believe in yourself, but you believe it's 3 p.m. And I thought that was a very Swami Vivekananda type statement. 3 p.m. is such a construct. Swamiji said, you Hindus, you believe in 33 million gods. Can't you believe in yourself? That's why Swamiji would say, don't say God, say I. Believe in yourself first. And that was the theme from this morning's satsang. Anyway, the sun, obviously, it sets a rhythm, not only for nature, like obviously the four seasons are determined by the movements of the sun, but more importantly, it sets the personal rhythm for our day-to-day lives. So the sun subsumes time. And so the journey of the sun through the seasons mirrors the journey of the soul through time. And because the sun and its seasons are circular and cyclical, so too is time cyclical. So you get a kind of Campbellian hero's journey, if you will. And so the themes of spiritual life are mapped onto the literal movements of the sun in the sky. Now, the reason we're bringing all of this up is, like I said last night, we know that the Mashiach, Yeshua, is a solar deity. And prior to Gentile forms of Christianity, and even well after that too, there's a clear understanding of this fact. And so his life in the world, in historicity, is often likened to the movement of the sun in the sky. We discussed this at length yesterday. So we talked about how the 12 disciples represent the 12 houses of the zodiac, and how the Christ moving through the 12 disciples is very important metaphor of how the sun moves through the 12 houses. And also, of course, like Christmas being, the winter solstice is when the sun stops. And then once Christmas comes around, which in the Gregorian world is December 25th, but in the Orthodox world is somewhere in January. So that Christmas day is when we observe the sun starting up again. So here's the Christ. He's born, as it were. And so days like this, like spring, the spring festival, which we call Easter, the resurrection of the Christ, obviously the Christ's resurrection is in line with the flooding of the Nile, or like the bursting of spring. And that's why we just celebrated recently our spring festivals too. The first day of the this month was the full moon, right? So that full moon celebrated the renewal of nature, the first day of the year, the Bengali New Year, the Tamil New Year. There are many calendars in India which celebrate, what was it, Sunday, last week Sunday, right after Hanuman Jayanti, the 13th of April, I think. That was the first day. So the fact that Easter and this day and Nowruz in the Persian community, they're all somewhat within the same month or so. It's an important point, because the celebration of spring and the renewal and the resurrection of spring. So one thing we have to keep in mind is not just like the solar mythology that we find with deities like Mitra or something like that, but also importantly the solar mythology as it applies to the Egyptian world, and how that through Alexandria and through the great Christian Renaissance of the second century, like where Christianity, Jewish Christian masters and Gentile Christian masters were mingling with like Neoplatonists in Alexandria, this great library, like in that kind of atmosphere, this world of Egyptian Christianity, Greek philosophy sort of hybrid thing emerged, which is what we call modern Christianity in terms of its philosophy and practice. So that myth of Osar or Osiris, importantly, is a solar myth also. And so in the Egyptian community, I'm speaking again outside the tradition. I don't know much about this, but from what I've heard from practitioners within that tradition and from some scholarship, it seems like they have something very similar to the Sandhya Vandana, the worship of the sun at various points throughout the day. And the sun itself in its various phases is attributed to different deities. So like Heter or Hathor or something would be like a noontime sun. And so she has a certain characteristic. And then different moments of the sun would be called different things. And the solar bark of Ra goes through these various phases in the sky and also in the afterlife. And so there's like a solar journey that Osiris goes on. And as we know, it's a journey of death and resurrection. He's dismembered by Seth, which of course reminds you of the dismemberment of Sati. And you can see, like I was talking about it in that lecture too, where we talked about the Shakta Peethas in India. So Lord Shiva is carrying the body of his immolated wife Sati, and he's burdened with grief, and so the entire universe is falling apart. And so Lord Vishnu throws his Sudarshana Chakra, his discus, which Lord Shiva himself gave Vishnu at one point, and then that discus chops up Sati into little itty bitty bits, and those
52
bits,
Shakti Peethas.
huh?
52 Shakti Peethas.
Yes, exactly that. Yes, Ji. So she chops up Sati, chops up Sati into all these little bits. And where they fall in India, this is an important point, it maps the divine reality, which is transcendent and non-material. It takes that transcendent reality and it maps it onto geography. It maps it onto the earth and the immanent reality. So this is an attempt to bridge the gap between spirit and matter, to say that matter, the earth of a place like Kamakya, that is itself spirit. Like this is a holy place. because the goddess lives here in a particularly strong vibration. So, like Maheshwara ji said, like in India, there are 52 of these, and according to different tantras, some tantras will say there are 64, some will say there are 51, some will say there are 108, and there's a debate as to which ones constitute Shakta Peethas. Like, is Tara Peeth a Shakta Peetha? It's a somewhat new Shakta Peetha. It's not mentioned in some of the tantras. Shankara lists about 12 in his hymn to the Shakta Peethas. However many there might be, this is an important point. Sati, who is a non-physical spiritual reality, is made into a physical reality and mapped onto the earth by this dismemberment myth. Yes? So similarly, in exactly that way, Osiris is betrayed by his brother Set and is chopped up into little bitty pieces. And in exactly that same way, these pieces fall into parts of Egypt. And so there are temples in Egypt that are custodians of parts of Osiris's body. So even after in the myth, he's like remembered. What is spirituality but remembering? In fact, the word for religion is to remember, in a sense, to reconnect, to reunite. But like after he's dismembered, after he remembers that he's Osiris and made the Lord of the underworld, after he's resurrected, even after that, there are certain sites in Egypt where the priestesses are custodians of like a particular body part. And just like in India, how Kamakya or Assam is considered the Shakta Peetha, the ultimate site of the veneration of the Divine Mother because it's her yoni, just like that, the lingam of Osiris also has a particular sacredness to the Egyptian tradition, from what I've heard and what I've read, speaking from outside the tradition, of course. Now, what's important to point out here is that the yoni of the Divine Mother is especially sacred during the July, August time in the month. This is called Ambuvachi, and this is when
Ambavati Mela.
exactly, and there's a mela. There's a beautiful mela that happens in Kamakya this time. Many temples in India will be closed because the goddess is having her period. And so this is a time for her rest and renewal. But in that time at Kamakya, that's when it's party time. Party on Wayne, party on Garth. You can see it's a real celebration of the fertility of the Divine Mother, her creative power. And the same is true with Osiris. The best thing about Osiris, like with Shiva, is his fertility, his power to, and he's not really a fertility god. That's the interesting thing. He's not like Priapus or Pan or something. He's got a kind of spiritual fertility, a creativity that manifests itself as the springtime. So his color is even the color of like the Nile when it floods. So the flooding of the Nile corresponds to this time, spring, and naturally then the resurrection that we see in Egypt around this time during the flooding of the Nile. That myth of resurrection is one-to-one matched to the myth of the Christ who, or the historicity of the Christ who resurrects on this particular day. So we can see the resurrection of this actual human being in history mirrors natural cyclical processes, but more importantly, that itself mirrors spiritual processes, which most importantly mirrors one's personal journey towards remembering. So that's a very important thing to keep in mind. Now, a lot of people will say, "Oh, therefore the Christ is just a metaphor. He has no historicity. He's just a myth, a device to be able to explain natural forces and natural rhythms." And some people will say, "Oh, and there's no such thing as nature either. That's just the mind's reading of the absolute. There are only spiritual themes. Christ didn't exist. History doesn't exist. Nature doesn't even exist." There are very radical positions that we can take. Now I want to take a maximally realist position today, and I want to say, no, there was a person in historicity probably. Probably he was the Christ. We don't really know that much about him, but what we know about him is enough and sufficient to be sufficiently inspired by his life. And that man in historicity, Christ, was verily the same fella who we called Krishna at one time, who we called Rama at some other time, who we called Buddha or Chaitanya at some other time, and who we are calling Ramakrishna at this time. So there's like just one incarnation, if you will, and at different times they take different forms and teach the same thing in slightly different ways adjusted to their time, place, setting. So that avatara I want to accept as real. Historically speaking, there was historicity to the avatara. And at the same time, to be maximally realist, I want to accept also all the solar and natural what do you call it, mythological force of that historical figure. All of that's also part of the journey, and with that we can explore some really profound spiritual themes. So in the Indian sense, there are very sacred days in the world of tantra. The first one is of course Amavasya, the new moon, but another one is Kal Ashtami, and it's just so nice that Easter is the Kal Ashtami of the month Vaishak. So the resurrection of the Christ falls on the first Kal Ashtami, the 8th day of the waning moon of the month Vaishak. So you can see it's already a sacred day in the Indian or in the Vedic sense, in the Vedic calendar. So Kal Ashtami is very important for Bhairava. That's why it's called Kal Ashtami, the waning fortnight. And the 8th day of the waning fortnight is when Bhairava Puja is particularly, exalted. And a while ago, I'd given a lecture called Tantric Christianity. Do you remember? It was like 2 years ago on Christmas time. Around Christmas time, we gave a lecture called Tantric Christianity and the Bhairava nature of Jesus Christ. And that's an important point that the Christ has a Bhairava nature. And so we talked about what Bhairava is like, both in the philosophical sense of being pure non dual consciousness, but also in the mythological sense of being the supreme embodiment of renunciation. A person who is absorbed in the poetic rapture of love and therefore is wholly insensitive to the world of money and power and pleasure and whatnot. A person who is not laying up their treasures where moth and rust doth corrupt and where thieves break in and steal. A person who truly is full. That Bhairava nature, both mythologically and actually, when we look at Bhairavas, on the banks of Manikarnika Ghat or whatever, that fullness, we see that manifest in the Christ. So we compared Christ to Bhairava. And part of why we were doing that is because, Christ's festivals like usually fall around new moons or Kalashtamis. So this Sunday is going to be the eighth day of the waning moon, and it's the day when we celebrate um, Bhairava. And it's also Easter. So Easter Sunday is Kalashtami. I just wanted to make that point. I think that's a nice and interesting point to make. Kalashtami. Oh my God, I had one more thing and then it slipped my mind. Yeah. Maybe I'll come back later. I just like one last point that I wanted to make about the Christ, and so I can complete this preamble a little bit and get into the material for today's lecture. What was it? Never mind. Maybe it will come back. Oh, yes. Yes, there it is. So not only is it the Christ's resurrection, which is in a sense a kind of birthday, right? It's like a birthday because he's being reborn, he's renewed after the 3 day period. But it's also this month, it's Buddha's birthday. Hello, Jessica, Jaima. It's Buddha's thrice blessed day, the day he was born, the day he died, and the day he attained realization. These are all considered three in one. They're like three similar events. So it's Buddha's literal birthday. It can also be considered his literal death day. He might have died on the same day that he was born. I think this is more metaphorical than necessarily historically accurate. But more importantly, it's the day of his recognition, the day of his liberation, which is considered a kind of rebirth and a kind of death. He died to what he was before, and he was born to what he always truly was anyway. So that's called the thrice blessed day. In some places, it's just called Vaishak or Vesak, which references the name of this Vedic calendar month. So this month, Vaishak or Vaishaka, is not just the Buddha's birthday, it's also the Christ's resurrection. It's also Shankara's birthday. It's also Ramanuja's birthday. It's a very exciting thing because there's so much happening this month, and it all seems to be themed around the birth of these like um, spiritual heavyweights, like these great founders, these great masters. Anyway, I just think that has something to do with the spring, maybe also the springtime and the resurgence of natural energy, which is the Jagrata Kundalini, Jagat Kundalini, the Kundalini of the world, which is of course correlated to the Kula Kundalini, the upsurge of energy that arises in the body, and that energy, of course, can lead to increased eros, and that's part of it too, but that same increased eros can also be channeled in a spiritual sense. So we can consider Christ the deity of like transformed eros, if you will. So that brings me to the next point, which is I think quite pertinent for today's lecture: the bridal mysticism of Christianity. You see, in the priestesses of the Christ, the nuns for Christ, many of them practice this form, especially in the Catholic tradition, of love known as bridal mysticism, what we in our tradition would call Mathura Bhava. That is considering Christ one's suitor, one's consort, one's bridegroom, if you will. So the Christ often spoke in this way about God. He often described God as the bridegroom, and he would say things like, "It is well that they eat and drink and make merry, for they are with the bridegroom." So he would use wedding metaphors a lot. Like the parable in Matthew, the parable of the wedding. The king wanted to have a wedding, and then he invited some people, and there's like a whole thing that happened. And somebody managed to sneak in without a wedding garment. And he's like, "Hello, friend. How did you get in here? It looks like you have no wedding garment on." You know? And then he says, "Bind him hand and foot and cast him into the outer darkness." I once told this to Swami Mahayogananda, and Swami Mahayogananda was like, "Oh, I forgot all the scary parts." He's like, "I like to focus on all the peace and love stuff." Yeah, oh hey Fabricio, good to see you. So what is it? Yes, there's this wonderful idea of like this bridal mysticism, and as Fabricio G is pointing out, Saint John of the Cross also saw Christ in this way and God in this way. Teresa of Avila, of course. Oh my God, she used to sign her letters Teresa of Jesus. What a beautiful thing. Nivedita used to sign also Nivedita of Vivekananda or something like that. So ever yours in Jesus, ever yours in Ramakrishna, that kind of signature is so beautiful. Anyway, Teresa used to sign Teresa of Jesus. And allegedly, according to one account, she had a dream. And in that dream, she saw a vision of the Christ. And the vision asked her, "Who are you?" And she said, "I am Teresa of Jesus." "Who are you, huh?" And allegedly, the vision said to her, "I am Christ of Teresa, or I'm Jesus of Teresa." Isn't that beautiful? She said, "I'm Teresa of Jesus," and he was like, "I'm Jesus of Teresa." So it's a reciprocated relationship. So as we love God, that much and more, God loves us. Inconceivably, God loves us. And the bridal mysticism of the monastic Christian world recognizes this fact that we should be in a kind of romantic relationship with God, if you will. A relationship where all the eros, all the passion which we feel around us now in the spring is directed full force towards God, who is the ultimate embodiment of bliss and beauty. So we see this very much with Radha and Krishna, that whole world of like mystical eroticism or mystical romance, or what we might call Mathura Bhava. So Swami Vivekananda is now going to tell us something about Mathura Bhava, the heated romance between matter and spirit, the romance between Radha and Krishna, the romance between the bride of Christ and the Christ, and the romance between the world and God. So that's why the Christ, even amongst his male disciples, would speak in this way. He told the Pharisees and the Sadducees, who were upset because they were having a good time. People just can't stand it when you're having fun. Yeah. Anyway, once we used to throw these like house shows, back when I was playing more actively in a rock band. My favorite venue was the apartment, to the chagrin of all the neighbors. But the thing is, I would invite them all, and they would come, and it'd be great. So my landlady didn't live in that same apartment, so when she would be gone, right? So I took full advantage of that, and I would go and knock on all the neighbors' doors and invite them, and they would come, and it would be great. We would throw a show, and it was wonderful. The whole house would be packed, and people would jump, and the whole thing would shake. And it was wonderful. It was rock and roll heaven. But then, usually, almost always, the cops would come and shut us down. Almost always around 11:30, which is always a moment of pride for me. I'm always like, yeah, okay, good. It was that good. The party was that good. We got shut down. And they're, like the UCLA village kind of cops would come, and they just kind of stand there, and they're like, all right, and so they break it up usually around midnight like that. So once we were trying to move out of our apartment building, and there was a building just across from ours, which we were trying to move into. Like it was like a much better fare for like a studio. We're like, okay, this is it. So we were there, and we were talking to the landlady in that building, and we told her that we live across the street, and she was like, yeah, oh my God, do you know there are people there? They throw these loud, really wild parties, and I've had to call the cops on them several times. I was like, oh, it's you. And she's like, how did you guys stand them? And I was like, yeah, right, like, oh my God. Delinquents, hooligans. Anyway, so to this day, our Wi-Fi name is What Disruptive Rock Music. So if you ever come to our house and you want the Wi-Fi, it's What Disruptive Rock Music 5G. Anyway. But like I remember like how I was at that time thinking this is exactly what King James might have felt when he saw all the witches having a good time, and he was like, "Oh, you know what this line in Exodus says? Thou shalt not suffer a witch to live." That's what the Greek says. Never mind what the Greek actually says. Never mind what the word pharmakia actually means. What King James thinks it means is call the cops on them. Shut down the party. Who likes to see others have a good time? Especially not in the name of God, right? The whole God business should be very like in fact, even Swami Vivekananda, when he first came here and started preaching, he was full of fun, full of jokes. He would poke fun at everybody. He would laugh. He would roll on the floor laughing. He was like a big boy. And this obviously attracted a lot of ire. And so many irate pastors would say, what kind of a religious preacher is this? He's so unserious, so flippant. And so Swamiji would say, cheerfulness is religion. But then he would also say, if God is grumpy, throw him overboard. He would say wild and scandalous things like that. But this idea that like religion should somehow be grim. There's the other end of the extreme, which is the youth pastor fellow who's trying to make everything sound like, like in the movie Spring Breakers, there's that youth pastor. He's like, isn't that cool, you guys? Isn't it so cool? Huh? Isn't the Christ cool? He's cool. Right? Right? He's rad. He's radical. He's so punk rock. Like there's also that vibe where you try too hard to make something that sounds heavy and grim, like fun. And so there's a kind of like, there's a born again smile. Have you heard about our Lord and Savior? Where you're like kind of like putting on like, oh, be of good cheer, the Christ has come, it's the God spell, it's the good news, be of good cheer. No, you can't fake it. I mean, you should. It's better try to be happy than to like just be grim and miserable all the time. But it's a true joy that the Christ was experiencing. And it was an infectious kind of joy which his community was experiencing. So they had a great time. They were partying on Wayne, they were partying on God. And then the Pharisees and the Sadducees, like King James, hundreds of years after this fact, were not okay with it. And they would say, like, oh, you should, this is Shabbat day, like, why are you having such a good time? And he would say, it is good that they eat and drink and make merry. It's good that they're having a good time because they are with the bridegroom. So that idea of bridal mysticism is a really important thing, even in Christ's time, and of course, right now also in modern Christianity, especially in medieval Christianity. So bridal mysticism, we're going to talk about that now, today, in our reading from Swami Vivekananda's Bhakti Yoga. I thought this might be the last little bit, and it's nice that we finish it on Good Friday, on this day where we're celebrating the Christ sacrifice at Calvary. It might be nice to read the whole Bhakti Yoga and just finish it off. But I think we'll just stick to this little piece. We're going to talk about God as my child and God as my lover, the last two attitudes that we want to cover. And then we would have finished this chapter called Human Representations of the Divine Ideal. Let's go back to the whole sun conversation. God is clearly something other than the sun. God is beyond any representation or any symbol that we can have of her. And yet, without these symbols, we cannot approach her. That's why the Jewish tradition at that time, it's so rich, it's so spiritually powerful. But because there weren't symbols, there weren't ways to meditate on God, it kind of defaulted to like rules and legalism. And so people didn't have a direct experience of God. They only had their books and their rules and their Pharisees and their Sadducees. So the Christ does something very important for Christianity. Or I should say for religion, the religion of his time, because the Christ was a rabbi. He was a Jewish teacher teaching to Jewish people in the Levant. Like the context was the traditions of Asherah and Baal and the tradition of Yahweh and the monotheism that developed from the tribal worship of Yahweh. Like that's his cultural context. And he had great reverence for the temples and for the priests. And so he was a practitioner of that tradition, whatever you want to call that tradition. In any case, he taught as a practitioner and master of that tradition. So he taught people to revere their priest. And the first miracle he performs, he heals somebody. Actually, no, the first miracle is he keeps the party alive. That's another thing. The Christ's first miracle is keeping the party going, turning water into wine. Once I pulled a reverse Jesus, just as a prank. I poured out all of my mom's really like in my house, there's very rarely any alcohol. My parents don't really drink it. But they had bought this like champagne bottle. They were saving it for some kind of special event. And I told you I was feeling very mischievous when I was a kid one day. And I poured out all the very expensive champagne and filled it up with water just for shits and gigs, just as a prank. Needless to say, I really got scolded. I got super walloped for that. But I called it the reverse Jesus. Anyway, so the Christ really, that was his first miracle, and that's I think really worth noting. But even when he healed the lame, or yeah, he healed the sick or something, he would tell them it was God alone who did it. I can of my own self do nothing. My Father who art in heaven does all these works through me. So go to the temple and honor your priest, for it is through their worship and it's through God that this miracle happened, not through me, like that. So the Christ was very careful to try to maintain the religion of his time, but he updated it. He renovated it. I come to fulfill, not to destroy, like that. And what was his innovation? His innovation was introducing, this is very important, a personal, intimate relationship with God, which at that time, in that cultural context, had vanished from the people. They felt like God was this judge in the sky that was so far away and too transcendent to even conceptualize. And a big part of this was because of the aversion to idol worship. The hatred for idols meant that people couldn't connect to God in their own way. They couldn't have a statue of Asherah or Baal. The other day, Natalie in Denmark, she sent me a picture of a Danish church, and there was a picture of a bull with wings. And I thought that was so funny because, Moses, he goes up to the hill, and when he comes down, having spoken to God, he sees his brother Aaron worshiping the golden bull, and Moses is like, for fuck's sake, I told you guys. Like, I can't go up the mountain for 10 minutes without you guys defaulting to idol worship. So break the bulls, break the statues of Asherah, like that kind of thing. So that was a mistake though, because while idol worship is limiting the infinite God to a statue, the alternative is not having any way to connect to God, not having any personal way to relate to the divine. These symbols are very important. And that's why Swami Vivekananda said, if idol worship can create a Ramakrishna, then take 1,000 such idols, I say. That was his response. Like, is Hinduism idol worship? Even if you can create a Ramakrishna, then it works. And why does it work? Because it gives a human representation of the divine, a symbol through which we can access God. So that's a very important idea that Swami Vivekananda develops in the book Bhakti Yoga. Earlier, we learned all about it. But now there's something even deeper. We can actually go beyond these symbols, so we don't really need to depict God as a bull with wings. We could, and that would be very helpful to see God as a blue guy seated on a meditation mat with matted locks and with a crescent moon tucked into his hair. That's very good. To think of God as a black-skinned woman with 4 arms, holding weapons, covered in blood, garlanded in heads. It's very important because God is that. God is everything. Surely God can also be that. But arguably there's a kind of stage that we arrive at in bhakti where those representations aren't so important anymore. Like God is the ultimate ideal who is intimately felt as a reality. Now the new kind of representation is not necessarily symbolic, but rather relational. And so the symbols now aren't like bulls with wings. The symbols now become the love that we already feel in our life with one another. So I love my master or my guru. Like that, I can feel love for God. I love my friends. Like that, I can love God as a friend. I love my child. I can love God as my child. I love my spouse or my romantic partner. I can love God in that same way. So these human relationships, they are now the models, the representations for the divine relationships. That's what the Christ added. That was the contribution of the Christ, arguably, in his cultural context. God is one's own father. And more importantly, a loving, benevolent father. And that's new, when compared to like the Old Testament idea of like the judge who is very aloof and who probably hates you and, expects that you follow all of his rules and if you don't, smites you. A very like notice me senpai kind of figure, a very transactional figure, who seems dangerous. And so it's hard to fall in love with that. It's hard to feel safe with that. So the Christ reminds us that God is love, and he demonstrated it through his own loving generosity and presence. So the Christ, he wanted us to have a personal relationship to God, but he also understands that it's impossible to conceive of God. Thou canst not look upon the face of God and live. So the Christ's very being is an important intermediary. Whoever has seen the Son has seen the Father. This is the key. Whoever has seen the Son has seen Brahman, you see, in another sense. So whoever has the symbol also has the thing in a certain sense. That's why we say when you get a mantra, it's no joke. When a mantra is passed to you from a lineage holder and that mantra comes through the lineage, what you're getting is not just a mantra. That's why you can't charge for it. That's why I have a big hang up when people charge thousands of dollars for mantras. In one sense, it's good because it helps you understand the value of what you received. But in another sense, it's bad because then you say God is worth $5,000. God is worth all the money in the world. It's like if you could put all the money in the world in cash on a boat and burn it, you should, because it's nothing compared to the value of God. What can money have to do with God? So that's the idea. You can't buy a mantra. It's not to be bought or sold because the mantra is God. It's not just a murti. It's actually God. Nama, Nami, Abhet. There's no difference between the name of God and God the named. So symbols, very important. Divine representations of human representations of the divine are in a way for us synonymous with the divine. It's a very powerful form of idol worship. We're saying the idol is God because God is the idol. So we're not limiting God. We're just expanding the capacity of the idol to take us to that reality. So we need these human relationships, and the Christ gave us one by virtue of appearing to us as a human. So that same God who is inconceivable, in her grace comes and becomes this fella. And this fella is difficult not to fall in love with. You might, how like some people say, I love Elvis, but not the fan club. You might have hangups with his followers. He probably might also. He's like, that's what you thought I was saying? Hate the gays? You got that that's what you got? Like that was your idea of, like, so he might also be really perplexed by all of these things. And I like that movie, A Brother, Sun, Sister, Moon, when Alec Guinness is the Pope, and then Brother Francis, he walks into the Vatican and he starts crying and he's like, oh my God, the opulence. And he gives his beautiful sermon against the opulence, preaching to go back to the simplicity of the Christ. And then Ben Kenobi, Alec Guinness, is so moved by that. And he's like, oh, you're right, my son. Like all that. So it's very beautiful. So the idea of like simplicity and all of that, like the Christ might. Anyway, it's not. Somebody once judged in Rome. Somebody said to Swami Vivekananda went to Rome and he loved it. He wandered about. And somebody once said to him, look at all this pomp. You think the Christ would have been okay with all this? And Swami Vivekananda said it's not right that we judge them. They felt God to be the greatest thing in the world. Why is it wrong that they wanted to like celebrate that in the most opulent way they could imagine? This is the way that they're showing their appreciation for God. Let them have it. Let's not judge them. Like that idea. So anyway, we don't need to get into that discussion now. The only point to point out here is that the Christ and Christianity might be different things. And so we gave a lecture some time ago called Christianity versus Churchianity, and a lot of people are understanding that now. So you don't even need like the Gospel of Thomas or the Gospel of Mary of Magdala. These are all really great. The Gospel of Philip. Like you don't really even need like Nag Hammadi Gnostic material. All that you need is there in the arguably the New Testament. You can understand it even within the context of Christianity. You can still come to understand this 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 character called the Christ, and it's hard not to love him, given his radical inclusivity. Like when you think about him, like tonight, as we'll be contemplating the Christ, you can imagine how he walked with such nobility and dignity to Calvary, and you can imagine him holding the cross. And then you can imagine as he's being crucified, looking with such compassion and love at the centurion and saying, "Forgive them, Father, they know not what they do." That unconditional love and surrender and forgiveness, that unconditional trust in God. And the night before, he has everybody stay up and keep a vigil and meditate. And he tells his disciples not to punch the centurion and bite their ear off like Mike Tyson or something like that. He's telling everyone to relax and to feel love. And then while he's crucified, he's singing psalms. Ela Elahi Lama Sabachthani. He's singing psalms, and then he's teaching. He's crucified, and he's telling his mother, "Oh mother, don't weep. Is he not your son too?" And he gestures at some random stranger in the crowd. So he's still teaching his message of universal love there in the midst of some horrific torture. It's nothing to him. He's full of joy, full of love, full of forgiveness, full of fun. He's still singing in the midst of all of that. So when you think of a person like this, hanging out with tax collectors and prostitutes, like what a progressive and beautiful individual. So you fall in love with him very easily. That's the point. The Christ appears as God himself in a way that the human mind can have a relationship with, can fall in love with. So that's what Bhakti Yoga is all about. And that's why the human representation cannot be dispensed with. It is essential to love. Because if you don't have a human representation, at best you can have what Swami Vivekananda is here calling Shanta Bhava. And this is in the Vaishnava literature too. Shanta Bhava means a quietistic, reverent kind of feeling about God. When you feel reverence for God. That's called Shanta Bhava. And what Swamiji says about it is interesting. He says it doesn't have that familiar madness. Or no, it doesn't have that madness, that is worthy of the name Bhakti. It's still Bhakti. Make no mistake. It's still, let me just find it. Here it is. He says in this place, he says, um, oh, sorry. Where is it? Oh, okay. He says, uh, his love is just the calm, commonplace love, a little higher than mere forms and ceremonies and symbols, but not at all characterized by the madness of intensely active love. It is said to be Shanta. So that Shanta Bhava is not at all characterized by the madness and intensity of active love. We see some people in the world who like to move on slowly, and others who come and go like the whirlwind. Christ came and went like the whirlwind, just like Chaitanya, just like Ramakrishna. So these were ecstatic lovers of God. They weren't peaceful rishis sitting in the cave. Even Buddha wasn't, by the way. When Buddha had his realization, he restlessly walked up and down a street. That street in Bodh Gaya is now called Buddha's Way. And on that street, my guru was just discussing it the other day, Buddha was pacing up and down. He walked up and down the street, restless, trying to give the good news of what he had discovered. So these beings are like active. They're mad. Buddha is like a madman in love, walking up and down the length of breadth of India, teaching anyone who would listen. Shankara, Chaitanya, Ramakrishna, they were all mad for God. So they weren't like calm, complacent rishis, absorbed in the self like that. They were mad. They were mad lover types. So having said that, the mad love for God is premised upon something relational, and that relational attitude is deeply human, and human relationships are therefore the best symbols for God. So we learned about seeing God as your master, an attitude that I'm very fond of, and we talked a lot about that attitude in the Hanuman Bhava context when we had Hanuman Jayanti last week. And then we talked about God as one's friend, which is an incredibly exalted attitude of seeing God as one's equal and enjoying this madhouse world as a play and being God's playmate. So we talked about that. Now, to close out our evening, I just want to read to you a little more from Swami Vivekananda's book. And I want to read you now the passages on Vatsalya Bhava, seeing God as one's child, which is also very active in the Christian tradition, by the way, because we find in the Christian tradition there's this veneration of the baby Christ, and there are people, Karuna, her neighbor, has baby Christ, baby Jesus, and she cares for baby Jesus the way like Yashoda might care for baby Krishna. So this attitude of seeing Christ as your child is also present in the Christian world. I've seen it a lot in the Catholic and Orthodox world, actually. So this is good also for today's topic. The next is what is known as Vatsalya, loving God not as our father, but as our child. This may look peculiar, but it is a discipline to enable us to detach all ideas of power from the concept of God. Ah, there it is. See, in the Jewish context, God is so powerful, so regal, so sovereign. God is a king that I can't even approach him. Who am I to approach God? I can't even look upon God's face. God is so great. So the more powerful God is, and God is the ultimate power, but the more powerful I think about God, the further God is for me in a sense. So the Christ brings God down one step. He says, God is not the king. God is the king. I am the king. But God is like a simple beggar king who is easy of access to all. What's more, that king is your father. Now, a child doesn't really think about the father's like opulence and power. Like, when the high court judge comes home, the wife tells him to take out the trash. And the child like sits on his lap and pulls at his beard. Like they don't think about the fact that, just this morning he like made or broke a life. Like they don't care about that. For him, it's just crazy old dad, whatever. That's the idea. He's a king, but he's your dad. The idea of God as father, God as mother brings God a little closer. And we can have another conversation about that attitude, which we love. Seeing God as Kali, seeing God as mother. That's a very powerful attitude. And it's different from seeing God as father. There's like a nuance there worth exploring. Anyway, so we love God as our child. That's even more radical. So now we take even more power away from God. Instead of saying God is the king, instead of saying God is the father, now God is the powerless dependent. God depends on us for the bath and for everything. I love worshipping Kali in this way because if I, fail to do her puja, I can relax. Because after all, I can tell myself, who's taking care of who? Am I taking care of you, Ma? Or are you taking care of me? Do you really need my Crafts mac and cheese right now? You who are the very nourishment in all my food. But if you had baby Gopala, your calculus would be different. You'd be like, oh my God, he can't take his own bath. I have to get home and I have to do the puja because that's how you see God as a child, dependent on you. So this may look peculiar, Swamiji says, but it is a discipline to enable us to detach all ideas of power from the concept of God. The idea of power brings with it awe. There should be no awe in love. The ideas of reverence and obedience are necessary for the formation of character. But when character is formed, when the lover has tasted the calm, peaceful love and tasted also a little of its intense madness, then he need talk no more of ethics and discipline. To conceive God as mighty, majestic, and glorious, as the Lord of the universe, or as the God of gods, the lover says he does not care. The lover does not care to see God in that way, as the God of gods or the Lord of the universe. It is to avoid this association with God of the fear creating sense of power that he worships God as his own child. The mother and the father are not moved by awe in relation to the child. They cannot have any reverence for the child. They cannot think of asking any favor from the child. And that's another point. Usually, God is just like sanctified shopkeeping for us. We go to God and we say, God, give me this, God, give me that. You see, we need God to be powerful, and we only love God on the basis that she's powerful. Kind of like how Jay-Z says in that song Monster. He's like, his weakness is love. He's like he can't seem to get enough of it, and he in his bit complains about how everyone around him are like lackeys. They all just love him for his fame and money. So it's very difficult actually to be a powerful, famous, rich person because then you don't know if people really love you for you or if they just love you for your money. Because you're always asking for favors and they're always doing you dirty and trying to betray you and just talking sweet to your face and like like all of that. It's a mess. But that's how we treat God. We love God because God is like Kanye or something. In the old sense. Like it was cool to know Kanye, cool to know Drake. So you want to pull up to the party with Kanye, so everybody knows that you know Kanye. But like, what if God was just a beggar on the street? Then maybe you wouldn't care for him anymore. If he had nothing to give you, if he was not all powerful and wasn't like rich, maybe you wouldn't care for him. So is that really love, or was it love for God and God's power, or just love for power and seeing God for like as a way to get power or something? How they say, get God and these things will be added unto you also. If the only reason you want to get God is so that these things will be added unto you also, chances are you don't love God. And so the idea of seeing God as a child is non-transactional. And we've been waxing lyrical about this for quite a while. Why real love is without any desire and without any fear whatsoever. Um, yeah. So now this idea. They cannot think of asking any favor from the child. The child's position is always that of the receiver, and out of love for the child, the parents will give up their bodies 100 times over. Just think about that. For the love of the child, the parents will give up their bodies 100 times over. So it's a love that asks for nothing, and it's a love that is fully self-sacrificing. Don't Christian martyrs demonstrate this? With such joy and cheer, they get cooked. They literally get cooked. You know how they're like, let him cook, let him cook. He's cooking. No, no, they got cooked. There was one, I think Saint Bernard or something. They like fried him on a frying pan. And you know what he said? As he was being martyred, he was being cooked. And then he said, okay, he said in Latin, I think, or Italian, he said, Saint Bernard, right? He's like, flip me over. I'm well done on this side. Flip me over and dine on. Like, have at it. Eat. I'm cooked. Literally. So anyway, like this idea of like total self-effacing love for God, the love that gives life and limb, the way the martyrs did, that's only possible when we love without desire and love without fear. When we love God the way a parent loves a child. And the mother is able to lift a car for her child. These and even greater works shall ye do, the Christ said, because the power, the engine of that activity is love. So 1,000 lives they will sacrifice for that one child of theirs, and therefore God is loved as a child. The idea of loving God as a child comes into existence and grows naturally among those religious sects which believe in the incarnation of God. For the Mohammedans, it is impossible to have this idea of God as a child. They will shrink from it with a kind of horror. I think that's a nice idea. So, like the Jewish tradition, the Islamic tradition, all these traditions that don't have an incarnation, they might shrink from it with horror. But the Christian and the Hindu can realize it easily because they have the baby Jesus and the baby Krishna. The women in India often look upon themselves as Krishna's mother. Christian mothers also may take up the idea that they are the Christ's mothers, and it will bring to the West the knowledge of God's divine motherhood, which they so much need. The superstitions of awe and reverence in relation to God are deeply rooted in our heart of hearts, and it takes long years to sink entirely in love our ideas of reverence and veneration, of awe and majesty and glory with regard to God. So, I think I'll stop there for now. The next reading is a bit charged in every sense of the word. The next reading is about Mathura Bhava, and I'd certainly like a little more time to unpack that. So we'll stop with this: seeing God as one's child. It's only possible when there's incarnations like Krishna, Rama. That's why there's like baby Krishna, Gopala, and there's Ram Lala, baby Rama. There's actually even a baby Shiva. Like there's a Bholenath kind of Batuka Bhairava kind of form of Shiva. So you can love Shiva like a child. There's a baby Kali also, and somebody put it in the chat. Larissa Ma put the baby Kali in the chat. So that's a beautiful idea that, oh, I think it's St. Lawrence. Thank you, Jessica. It's not St. Bernard. Sorry, it's St. Lawrence who got cooked. Lawrence of Arabia. Yeah. There's never mind. I was thinking there's a place in La Brea and it's called Lawrence of La Brea. So every time I say Lawrence of Arabia, I think of that rug store. Anyway, so let's close here. I'm unfortunately going to need to go because we have to prepare for the puja tonight. But I think we'll save the Mathura Bhava stuff for next week. I just wanted to offer this next bhava, which is called Vatsalya Bhava, seeing God as one's own child. So if you'll excuse me, I'll take my leave now. It's Jesus Puja. So we'll prepare a little bit for tonight. Swami Brahmananda was very fond of Jesus Puja. Oh, hey, Tera Shiva, where are you? Come. You're living in LA. What are you doing? We've only had you in this house one time. Come, come, come. Anyway, so they used to offer wine and fruit cake. Do you guys know what fruit cake is? I think in America it's called Christmas cake or something. And it was very popular where I grew up. And my grandmother was, the first question that my grandmother asked Vijaya was like, "Can you make fruit cake?" Like it's a very important thing in our. I should just show we haven't learned it yet. But my grandmother, she used to make it with brandy, which is really interesting. So anyway, it's like a British thing. It's like a British colonial thing. Fruit cake, Christmas cake. So anyway, Swami Brahmananda, he used to worship Jesus with that fruit cake. And one time, one of the I think American or British ladies went to Belrumat and she was sitting there at that puja and she said she started to Swami Brahmananda went into a kind of mood and she saw that he was talking to somebody and later when asked about it he said, "Oh, I saw the Christ. He was wearing a long blue robe and he was standing over there." So Swami Brahmananda had many visions and he would often have visions of the Christ. There was also one devotee to whom he gave a Christ mantra. That's why there are Christ mantras in our lineage, by the way. So some of you might have received Christ mantra. There's actually like a Ramakrishna Jesus mantra that's in this lineage for Christ. It's very powerful. And it probably comes from things like this. Anyway, so Ramakrishna had great reverence for the Christ. He had a vision of the Christ, all of that. But Brahmananda especially would have these visions. So one disciple came and he got the Christ mantra. He was about to get the Christ mantra or something. I forget the details of the story. But as he was going down the bank of the river, he saw the Christ. And later he saw that it was Swami Brahmananda alone who was standing there. So stuff like that, in our tradition. So we're gonna do a Jesus puja, so I better go and get ready for that. I just have to tell you one more story. My favorite Christ story in our tradition. Swami Premananda was standing outside the Jagannath temple at Puri, and there was a Christian missionary there who was abusing Hinduism. He was saying, and he's preaching outside the temple where Hindus go to pray to Jagannath, a form of Lord Krishna. Just like how like Westboro Baptist will go stand outside the abortion clinics or something like that. Just like that. That same bhava, of somebody standing outside of an institution they don't politically believe in, religiously believe in, and they're preaching against it. So this guy was there, this preacher, and he was telling everybody that these are false idols, etc. And it kind of like pissed Premananda off. He was like, this is just so mean. Like, why do you have to come here and dishearten all these people? And so, what Swami Premananda did in response is really interesting. He started a kirtan. Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare, with like drums and everything. And once he's like a saint, right? Like, so the bhava of this is unparalleled. He started doing it, and everybody started joining, and they drowned out the Christian missionary. So instead of like fighting him, he just started his own thing in one corner and they drowned him out and pushed him away. He was very proud of himself. He was like, aha, I stood up for Dharma. And you know what happened? Indians will be very pissed at me for stuff like this. Indians hate it when I talk about the Prophet Muhammad. You know, like the doctors hate him. like Indians are very upset, very many of them, because they've got this kind of weird Hindu nationalism thing going on right now, and so they're very averse to Christianity, very averse to Islam, and things like that. But not so in our lineage. What happened that night is profound. So many people who are listening to this might not like what I'm going to say next. Some of you might be like, "Yeah, show him. You show that Christian missionary. Chase him out with your Hare Krishna." But you know what happened? Swami Premananda, proud of himself, went to bed, and Sri Ramakrishna came to him in his dream, and Sri Ramakrishna said, "Why did you do that? That was so mean of you. Don't you know that that man was preaching my name only? He was preaching the Christ." And Sri Ramakrishna is saying, you had no right to drown him out. That was an act against me, God. So if you were to harm any follower of God anywhere in any tradition, you are harming only God. Because it's his name alone that that person is preaching. That story really moves me. And you know what happened? After this, Swami Premananda was chastised by Sri Ramakrishna. He was so moved by this that the next day he tracked down that preacher. And it was very hard to find him. At that time, there's no like Facebook. You can't like, there's no yellow pages. Like he just had to ask around and actually track down this preacher. And he walked miles and miles to find him and heartily and profusely apologized to him. He said, last night my guru came and my guru told me that it was wrong for me to do that. And I just want you to know that I'm sorry. Like that, the whole thing. He apologized to the preacher. I don't know how the preacher took it. And especially if he told the preacher, oh, he told me that you were preaching his name alone. I don't know how the preacher would have taken that. But the point here is, this is the attitude of our lineage, the attitude of seeing the divine in all traditions, because that one God is Christ, is Krishna, is the Prophet Muhammad, is whatever name you want to call him. So today on Good Friday, we're commemorating the Christ, who we know is the same person as Krishna, as Rama, as Buddha. And more importantly, we're commemorating the Christ as a dual avatar. Christ along with Mary of Magdala, Krishna along with Radha, Rama along with Sita, Chaitanya along with Vishnu Priya, Buddha along with Yashodhara. Like that. We're thinking of all these beings, but because we have Sri Ramakrishna, we understand that they don't come alone. History remembers Christ. It's just now catching up on Mary of Magdala. But because we have Ramakrishna, we know that there would be no Ramakrishna without Sarada Devi. So when we talk about the Christ, we're really talking about Shakti. And so we ought to talk about the Christ Shakti also. So today, on this day of spring, a nature day, celebrating the rejuvenation and resurrection of nature, we celebrate Osiris and Christ and Rama, Krishna, Buddha, Chaitanya. May this be an offering to those great lovers of God. And may we practice what they preached, which is to see God as our own intimate loving friend, our own intimate loving child even. Om, may this be an offering to the Christ. Om, Shanti, Shanti, Shanti. Hari Om Tat Sat. Shri Ram Krishna Arpanam Astu. Jai Ma. Okay, bye.